My name is David Carlson. I'm with the University of Notre Dame Press. Thank you for joining us for a particularly exciting installment of our Books for Better Understanding series. The press has just published the final installment of Marian Schwartz's translation of March 1917, which is Note 3 of Aleksander Solzhenitsyn's The Red Wheel. So yeah, book one came out all the way back in November of 2017, followed by book two in November 2019, book three in October of 21. And we know that many of our readers, myself included, have been eagerly waiting for book four, and it is here at last. And so with this volume, March 1917 is available in its entirety in English for the first time. So today, we are honored to be joined by our esteemed guests, Marian Schwartz and Dan Mahoney. Marian Schwartz is a prolific, award-winning translator of Russian classic and contemporary fiction, history, biography, criticism, and fine art. A modest sampling of her work includes translations of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, many works of Russian emigre author Nina Berberova, New York Times bestseller The Last Tsar by Edvard Radzinsky, Vasily Paskov's Lost in the Taiga, and perhaps not least, Aleksander Solzhenitsyn's March 1917. Her many honors include awards from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Banff International Literary Translation Center, the Association of Women in Slavic Studies, and a Novella and Translation Award from the Literary Review. Since February 24, 2022, Marian has been focusing on translating human rights journalism for rightsinrussia.org and the works of Russian writers who are working in opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Putin regime. Daniel J. Mahoney is an emeritus professor of political science at Assumption University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and senior writer at Law and Liberty. He's the author of numerous books, including Recovering Politics, Civilization and the Soul, Essays on Karen Manant and Roger Scruton, which was published in 2022, and The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse of Then and Now, which will be published in the spring of 2025. He has devoted much of his scholarly career to Solzhenitsyn. He published The Other Solzhenitsyn, Telling the Truth About a Misunderstood Writer and Thinker in 2014. He co-edited The Solzhenitsyn Reader, New and Essential Writings from 1947 to 2005, and wrote Aleksander Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology in 2001. So thank you both very much for being here. Very excited about this conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I think you're right to note a sense of completion. Not that the Red Wheel is completely available in English, but it's a lot closer to being completely available in English than it was just a few years ago. We owe that to Marian and among others, and Marian's really wonderful efforts in translating the four volumes that make up the core, the centerpiece of the Red Wheel, the volumes March 1917. And of course, there's the two volumes of April 1917 to come, as well as the kind of afterwards where Solzhenitsyn outlines what he might have written if he had continued initially as a young writer when he designed, you might say, the various knots, the nodes, periods of discrete time that he would investigate, given the massive amount of events and material. He chose to concentrate on certain moments in time that were particularly revelatory or important, and he proposed covering the years up to 1945, which would have been a massive project. And there were reasons why Solzhenitsyn backed away from that initial plan. One of it being the near impossibility of such a feat. But also, I think the more Solzhenitsyn explored, you might say, the meaning of the Red Wheel, that image of the accelerating locomotive of revolutionary transformation and the coming of a totalitarian regime and ideology in power in what was the Russian Empire, the more he realized, and here his views were quite, I think, countercurrent, the more he came to the conclusion that the defining event was not Red October, as almost everyone thinks, from the counter-revolutionary right to the Bolshevik left, the decisive event for him really was the February Revolution. Now, you might say, why am I talking about a February Revolution when we're here to discuss a volume called March 1917? And any student of Russian history or politics or literature very quickly discovers that there were two calendars: the Julian calendar, which was the Russian calendar until 1917, and the Western Gregorian calendar. And there's about a 12 to 13-day difference between the two. So in ordinary language, in ordinary discourse about the Revolutionary Year, which was 1917, the February Revolution was conveyed as March, just like an earlier not October 1916 is conveyed in the English edition as November. So that's the difference. And it can be confusing. The October Revolution um, occurs, or at least begins, on November 7th, which was October 23rd, according to the other of the previous calendar. So anyway, I get that out of the way to just avoid any confusion on the listener's part. So what does it mean to say that Solzhenitsyn came to see March 1917 as the revolutionary moment par excellence? I think Solzhenitsyn believed that the much vaunted provisional government, which officially governed Russia for about 8 months in 1917, a government. Initially, there was some involvement of the constitutionalist opposition, people like Guchkov, or cadets like Milyukov, the foreign minister. But soon the provisional government took on a more and more liberal and socialist coloration. The defining figure there, who plays a major role in this volume, is Alexander Kerensky. And of course, it's challenged right from the get-go by the Soviets, by the workers and Soviet deputies and the executive committee. So you have two rival governments, one committed to a more thoroughgoing revolution, the other representing, as I said, more moderate and liberal and socialist elements. The problem, as all of March 1917 makes clear, but this volume, book 4, makes particularly clear, the provisional government didn't really govern. Solzhenitsyn gave an interview in February 1917 with Yana Sapiets from the BBC Russian service as the 5th anniversary of his forced exile from the Soviet Union. And he was asked about this, and he said, well, the provisional government governed for -2 days. And that was a provocative way of suggesting that it never really controlled the levers of power and authority, partly because it was challenged by the Soviets from the left, partly because its own legitimacy was questionable. There's a scene in one of the earlier volumes of March where Milyukov is yelling at the crowds, like, who elected you? And somebody asks him, who elected you? That's always a problem in a revolutionary situation. There's a scene, Marian will remember this, when General Alexiev is reading a memo from the Minister of War, Guchkov, who's one of the tougher figures in the provisional government, one who wants to hold on to authority in the army, who wants the government to govern. And essentially, Guchkov confesses to Alexiev that we don't govern. We have no authority to govern. And I would say this is dealt with in a previous nod. I think I'll turn things over to Marian in a second. But I think if you had to look for an event and a symbol of the ineffectual character of the provisional government from the get-go, as I said, it would be order number one. This order that went out to the armed forces that essentially undermined the exercise of authority. Officers in some way ceased to be officers. It allowed, deliberation among soldiers. It got rid of salutes, and, Russia's still at war. Now, whether or not the war was wise, whether it was wise of the new government to try to continue it, all of those are very important questions intrinsically and for Solzhenitsyn. But um, once order number one was issued, you saw this sort of severing of the very principle of authority. And there's a dramatic scene in an earlier volume. Admiral Nepianin, who's the head of the Baltic Command of the Navy, he's a forward-looking officer. He supports the provisional government. He sees the need for reform, and there's a very dramatic scene written as like a play where Nepianin and his officers are murdered by these Red Guards, and it's a portent of things to come. And let me add one more thing, and that is, well, Solzhenitsyn was extremely critical in previous nodes of the ineffectualness of the Tsar, Nicholas, his preoccupation with family over his public duties, his inability to move with the times, not in a progressive way, but just as a statesman. So there's no more, contrary to legend, Solzhenitsyn wants to go back to the beautiful Tsarist period. There's no more damning indictment of the sclerosis of the old regime than the one you find in the Red Wheel. On the other hand, Solzhenitsyn is very critical of the cadets, the liberals, and the socialists for not seeing enemies to the left. They're still fighting a rearguard action against counter-revolutionaries who they see around every corner. They're still filled with revolutionary inebriation. But they're a new set of enemies, and I'll mention Lenin here. Lenin plays a role in this. Not He's still in Zurich. Remember, in November 1916, he had told his revolutionary compatriots, "We'll never live to see the revolution." Yeah, so much for knowing the unfolding of history. And now he's in the latter part of the nod. He's negotiating with the Germans, to return home in that sealed car. Of course, it was a supreme act of treason during war, and for the sole purpose of promoting revolution. So in the backdrop of this nod is there's more to come, but there's almost a sense that we know not only do we know historically that the Bolsheviks triumph in the fall of 17, but we know that the provisional government is incapable at almost every level, moral, civic, constitutional, and just in terms de facto, in terms of power, of preventing a fuller unfolding of the Red Wheel. And anyway, Marian, maybe you could. I think what's sometimes underappreciated in approaching this book and Solzhenitsyn the whole song, this work is so sui generis, just like the Gulag Archipelago is sui generis. But the way Solzhenitsyn combines a kind of dramatization of history with literary art, with some fictional characters, diminished, I think, as in March 17 compared to the previous knots, and some really fascinating scenes. Every reader of the Red Wheel knows about these street scenes, that are even more plentiful in the previous knots that reveal so much about the atmosphere and the mood. But we also have scenes, we have dreams, Varsonofiev, the stargazer, has these dramatic apocalyptic dreams, in the beginning and the middle of the book. And maybe you could pick things up here in terms of this unique mixture of literary art and dramatized history and some of the backdrop in Solzhenitsyn's Diary of the Red Wheel, what that might reveal to us about the inspiration for this unique bringing together of history and literature.
Well, I wanted to go back to the point you made about one of the most important points, especially this volume, of the provisional government essentially not governing, and the ineffectual. Well, there was nobody governing. It wasn't like there was somebody else doing it instead of them. But it occurs to me that in a lot of ways, the way the chaos that he describes, that's so convincing. I mean, you're convinced that the provisional government was not governing. Very much reflects what first struck me about the first volume, the first book of March 1917, which is the scenes of revolution, of the bread riots and the confusion, the street riots in St. Petersburg, and how, I mean, it was practically minute to minute the way he recounts it. It's a you are there moment as far as telling of history. And by the time you get done with that, you think, well, of course they were screwed. Of course this was not going to happen. Of course the government was going to fail. And I think that it's one thing to sort of say, oh, he said that it's not going to, the government's not functioning. There's nobody at the top. But how he made that convincing, the way he wrote it is just absolutely remarkable, because as he said, he didn't write Dan's referring to this other volume he wrote called The Red Wheel Diary, which he kept during the time from the very beginning of when he was writing the book, which is I don't know, it may be my favorite of all the volumes, because I think it's one of a kind for a writer to be so self-reflective and so articulate about process and how he marshaled all this information. He had more information than he could have ever used, and somehow he managed to figure out how you have these very short chapters, and he had other methods that he used. But one of the things he said that I love is he said, and I think I actually wrote it down, but I can't find it on my piece of paper. He talked about how you don't write about the things that people already know. You're not telling the obvious history. You're not trying to be the Norton edition of the Russian Revolution. You're trying to convey the impact of the history and the nuance of the interactions between the different strata of society and the different players. And it's almost like, it's not, as here's one quote, he says, the hidden resolution of an event is always what's important, not its outward unfolding. And that you don't actually make explicit, you let the reader fill in the blanks. So there's a great deal of that, of where the reader is actively drawn in to draw conclusions. It's a miracle that people like this book as much as they do, and it's because of the way he wrote it. Because it could be incredibly dull, and which he himself acknowledged in his diary. He said, if I do this as a standard exposition and narrative, no one's going to read it and no one's going to like it. And no one's going to understand his point of view, I think. It's not so much, I don't think he cared whether anybody liked it. What he cared was whether people appreciated his insights. And so he did it. It's for a book that includes so much information. I mean, which is it, the second node that only covers 3 days? Is that a second book? something like that. The first one's
That's
5,
right.
the second one's 3 days, 250,000 words for 3 days. I mean, the level of detail is hair-raising practically. And yet in the course of this, he changes up his pacing like any good writer would do. He has pretty straight narratives about events that happened, and then he'll have interactions between real characters, real figures, the fictional characters. He makes this a huge effort to represent all segments of society, and is able to do that in a way that, I mean, most of the historical characters left memoirs, they left papers, we have primary documents. For the soldiers, for most of the women, for a lot of these, we don't have, he wasn't working with primary materials. He was writing fiction in service of explaining what was happening at the different levels. And I think that kind of, he develops a rhythm of going from one to the next and then coming back, so that the reader kind of gets into a rhythm of reading as well as he had for writing. I think the other thing that, as far as the writing, that I think is unusual and very appealing, is he, for all his protestations that he knew nothing about women, he writes very good women characters, especially the fictional ones.
You're thinking of like Susanna and
there's like, I think I looked, there's something like 12 non-historical female characters in the
that's
book.
right, that's right.
Just huge numbers: Olda, Laconia,
Yeah.
sisters, the aunts.
The two revolutionary ants are extremely memorable
I
characters.
love those revolutionary aunts.
They initially, when you first introduced to them in August 1914, you think this must be a caricature of a certain type, but they're not. It's sort of the quintessence of these two aunties who try to imbue in their niece this kind of deep religious attachment to the revolutionary cause, including the terrorist cause. And they're very, those chapters are really full of vitality and life. The interesting thing is Solzhenitsyn could be quite artful in dealing with characters whose ideas he had no sympathy for. And that's really important, I think.
Yeah, and with those aunts, not only were they revolutionary, supporting the revolution, but there was a difference between them. I mean, I think one of them was like, went to prison. I mean, it's fictional.
That's right.
Was like an anarchist and went to prison, and one was more left-wing revolutionary. So he's drawing subtle distinctions between leftist politics. I love and I love the chapter on Kollontai. I mean, why he had to go into, I mean, he goes into for a long time about free love and about her feelings about marriage. And I mean, he's got a lot, I mean, he's busy, he's got a lot on his plate. And here he is with this ability to breathe. He brings that ability to breathe into the text.
Yeah, we should mention for the listener, Kollontai had very whatever you want to call it, visionary utopia, but she had very progressive views about men and women and free love and the obsolescence of the bourgeois family. And at one point, she's thinking to herself, Lenin doesn't get this stuff. I have to work on him, And she's very much a Bolshevik, but with this, the beginning of the Leninist period, there's still some of this visionary stuff in the air. If you're anti-bourgeois, why not be anti-bourgeois in a fundamental way, everything related to sexuality, family, marriage, and all this. And I couldn't help thinking, I too was very taken by the care in which that portrait is drawn. You hear her voice, you have a pretty full articulation of her vision, her ideas. And yet, if you look at her life as a whole, she becomes this Stalinist diplomat, a time server. Am I right about that, Marian? I'm pretty sure.
Ambassador to Sweden till 1945 or something.
That's right. And I mean, you didn't survive during that period of the purges and the war without, real, a kind of prudence that meant full accommodation. So there's a tragedy to her figure, the vitality that ends up being another form. She ends up being a servant of a regime whose limits she must have appreciated somewhere in that mind of hers. So yeah, there are many portraits like that. I'm very taken because he plays a role in the Red Wheel as a whole. The Father Severian, he's the priest who early on in November 1916, Sonia Solzhenitsyn, who is the fictionalized father of Solzhenitsyn, and it's really interesting because he initially is a kind of Tolstoyan pacifist. He feels sorry for Russia. He volunteers. He's sort of torn between his sense that the war is a waste, but also his love of country. And he has this dialogue with this priest who's certainly intellectually minded, serious, quite orthodox, not at all in the Tolstoyan direction. He doesn't sympathize with revolution, but he sees that the state of the church is deeply problematic, that there needs to be an opening to a more authentic Christian spirit. But there's a whole chapter, I believe, 548 on him. And I've always been interested in this character because he seems to be, and it's hard in Solzhenitsyn's work to know exactly who speaks for the author, but he comes close to speaking for the author, I think, in that he sees the need for a church that has freed itself, you might say, from the tutelage of the Tsarist state, but he's critical, or he has these deep reservations about what, going with the wind, with the sort of progressive winds. And there's a beautiful line in that chapter where he says, bureaucracy, democracy, socialism, all these modernized, and none of them are going to save us. None of them are going to save the church. Something more fundamental, some sort of. And again, if people get Solzhenitsyn wrong, he's not talking about a return to some petrified past. That's not possible or desirable. But this priest chaplain represents a vision, I think, of how some of the old values and virtues could be renewed. And of course, what he represents is crushed from the beginning. But I take that chapter to be a kind of reflection on Solzhenitsyn's part of better and higher spiritual possibilities. You mentioned, Marian, the historian Olda, very interesting character. She's a very attractive character in many ways, and yet she's probably the most conservative of the women painted by. She's a professor of medieval history. She has a deep attachment to the monarchical idea, and yet she knows that the Tsar doesn't live up to the monarchical ideal. And of course, she's having an affair with the married Colonel Vortintsev. And it's interesting, as Russia's falling apart in this moment of tragedy, the war, the rise of totalitarianism, two of the more responsible and attractive figures, Vortintsev and Olda, are preoccupied with their messy personal lives. So that adds another. You want to add anything about these characters I brought up, or?
characters so much, but I think it's you've made a good point about how people apply a very conservative picture to Solzhenitsyn. And one thing that one of the other things I loved in the diary was him mentioning periodically the authors that he admired. And these are very smart. I mean, these are like the best writers. He really, and they weren't conservative writers. He mentions, well, of course, Tolstoy. He's always thinking about Tolstoy,
Sure.
which, having translated Anna Karenina, makes perfect sense to me. Even just the way the books are written makes perfect sense to me. But Zamyatin. Now, Zamyatin was very, very much a part of the kind of creative explosion in the 20s in Russia. He wrote the dystopian We, this is his most famous book. But the one that really completely blew me away was that he loved Tsvetaeva. Now, Tsvetaeva was conservative, well, she was just a mess politically.
She was anti-communist, but she was
she's just a romantic, but she was extremely revolutionary as a poet.
Sure.
And one of the great and one of the greatest poets of the 20th century in Russia, and completely broke all the rules in the most just thrilling ways. And then that Solzhenitsyn would actually, of the maybe 5 authors I saw him name in that book, she was one of them. The other one that he mentions is Bunin. Towards the beginning of the diary, when he's talking about writing the book, and he thinks, if Bunin should have written this book. He keeps saying, I'm only writing this book because nobody else will or can. But Bunin could have. But when I go back and look at Bunin, all he writes about is love, basically, and relationships, and he doesn't talk about history when he could have. And so
he did. I mean, his diaries on the Revolution and the Civil War are quite interesting. But you're absolutely right. As a writer, he found.
Look what Solzhenitsyn said, not me.
Oh yeah. No. You're talking about what he said about Bunin.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. It's just I think Solzhenitsyn was struck Bunin's diaries, crazed days or whatever. There, he's was extremely attentive to the sort of nihilism, the moral nihilism unleashed by the revolution. But yeah, he had no way of incorporating that into his literary work in a broader sense. No. Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Richard Tempest, Slavis at the University of Illinois, has published a big book on Solzhenitsyn's fiction, where he addresses this question that in some broader philosophical and moral sense, Solzhenitsyn is anti-modernist. If one means, I'm not using modernist here in the narrowly literary sense. I mean, if it means a preference for the novel and the new over the tried and true, he's deeply suspicious of that kind of mentality. On the other hand, he himself is quite experimental. The Red Wheel itself utilizes all sorts of experimental phenomena. I mentioned the street scenes, and we could add the use of the proverbs and the directorial directions he gives for those who might want to dramatize some of the specific chapters. I mentioned the assassination of Admiral Nepomuk. That's one where that happens. And so there is a kind of effort, I think, politically. Solzhenitsyn is interested in some sound, prudent melding of tradition and modernity. That's why, he likes Pyotr Stolypin so much, the reformist prime minister. But artistically, there's more modernism in Solzhenitsyn than he might admit, and so there's that's something really worth exploring. I think that he's not hidebound or reactionary in terms of his will, and he himself acknowledged his indebtedness to the American novelist John Dos Passos, for his USA trilogy, 1919, and the other volumes, because Dos Passos was one of the first to experiment with those modernist techniques at the service of telling a big national story.
I think that what's interesting about Solzhenitsyn's use of these different moments, the screen moments, the newspaper extracts, the various the fictional dialogues, is that it's very organic. He's not doing it because he wants to invent something new or be fancy. He's doing it because he thinks it's the best way to convey the material. So he doesn't, and I think that's one of the reasons that they work so well, is because it's not theoretical for him. It's a way, he's looking for anything that's going to be compact and well, especially and condense the moment that he's trying to convey. And if he has to do it in a screen scene, I mean, it's a lot. I mean, it's sort of modernist, but it's like Eisenstein. It's like an Eisenstein movie. These screen scenes, especially in the book one of the streets and street shots. So I think that I just think he was technically a fabulous writer. And his ability to step back and see what works and what doesn't work for his purpose. He had that higher purpose always in front of him. He was always thinking about that, of how he's going to convey this portion of Russian history, and particularly the revolution, with the revolution at its core. And he was willing to do just about anything. I think he would have, if he could have thought of another thing to do, he would have done that too.
I think your point that the modernism, you might say the techniques are always at the service of his realism and his ethical realism. It's to convey the truth, to convey what happened, to convey the sort of deeper sense of things. And I should add a really important, I think, philosophical point. All of this is sort of at the surface, in a way, of a general proposition never explored too abstractly, namely that Solzhenitsyn doesn't think this whole thing was preordained. Against Tolstoyan fatalism, might say the final chapters of War and Peace, the kind of official view that history, is beyond, human beings don't fundamentally, even the commanders in the field don't really determine the outcome of war. And Tolstoy is very complicated, and Marx is less complicated. Marx's philosophy of history is deterministic, and some versions of it, the Leninist, Stalinist version, were quite vulgar, the Diamat and all that determinant. Solzhenitsyn is against all that this need not have happened. And yet, as events proceed, and one thing that really strikes me studying the Red Wheel, it's not so much what some people have done, it's what other people haven't done, what the Tsar didn't do, what with the assassination of Stolypin, the various time servers who dominate the Russian political class, what they don't do, or decisions that are made like entry into the war, even if it didn't serve Russia's broader interests, not to mention, 1,000 things along the way. And so Solzhenitsyn allows us to understand, to come back to the image of the Red Wheel, that as the Red Wheel, the image of the train, it's acceleration. Its acceleration becomes more intense, more inevitable, if we can say it that way. But it takes these varied means. Sometimes they're more or less historical chapters in some of the nodes, and others You know, I think the street scenes are among the most powerful things I've ever read. If you want to get a sense, do you remember earlier on when he's talking about, I think it's Obadovsky, the engineer, is observing a mob and how it operates, you know, and it's like it has all these feet, you know, but is there any sort of controlling rational factor? There's images throughout that are such well done. Marian, one other thing I want to just respond to that I thought was a very important point you made, which is too many people who should know better say things like, Solzhenitsyn, you know, they dismiss Solzhenitsyn. Well, he was historically important. He exposed the Gulag, you know. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was published at an important moment. But there's an underestimation of Solzhenitsyn as a writer, you know, and in all these different genres. But he's an extremely gifted, talented, and hardworking writer and craftsman. And I think, you know, before, I mean, I don't know how much of this critical literature you've read, but it was very commonplace before any of March had appeared, even before November 1916. People would just say that the Red Wheel's a failure. No one reads it. It wasn't even available in English. There was this sort of, I don't want to call it a critical consensus because it was just sort of a, you know, a set of nostrums that were bandied about or in the air, a kind of underestimation. But with you, I've discovered so many people, some critics, and but plenty of readers who are following this thing to the end, who have come to appreciate um, the value of the work, and the value is not simple. It's historical, it's moral, it's all of that. It's a contribution to Russian culture, but it is also a great artistic feat, and I'm happy to see a greater recognition of that. Look,
Well, one of the other things of the untranslated things that I translated was a screenplay he wrote, which was his friends at Mosfilm just gave him the contract so that he would have. It was after he got kicked out of the writers' union, and so they wanted just to give him a job to do something. So he did the screenplay called The Parasite, and it is delightful. It's hilarious. It's so perfect for the time it's set, and actually the main character is a female, and I enjoyed it to death. But for him, it was like just a knockoff. I mean, he felt that he could, that kind of novel writing that was going on. He said, other people, let other people do that. It's, you know, it's not important, and it's not, you know, it's not what's lies in my heart that I need to get done. And he considered that just a more or less a waste of his time to be doing that, but that he could do that so lightly, this absolutely charming little screenplay. I'll tell one more story. Just, I know we've been running long, but of how I got to when I first started translating these was one of the great pleasures of being a translator in my lifetime is that occasionally you get a phone call from somebody you had no idea was going to call.
uh-huh.
You know, it's like completely out of the blue. And I pick up the phone one day and it's Stefan Solzhenitsyn. And I took a deep breath and I said, oh, you know, hello. And he said, he tells me about the project and, you know, would I be willing to translate? At first it was just the first 2 volumes. And I said, you know, I started learning Russian in 1969 and started studying Russian literature. And I said, one of the most influential books in my whole life was Ivan Denisovich. And I said, I owe everything to that book. And I don't care what this book is like to translate. It's like me, it's coming full circle. It's me paying back all that I've taken from Russian literature over the years. And I feel that very much today. I mean, there's so many similarities to the situation today as to when during the Cold War, as far as translating Russian literature. But, if someone had told me I was going to be translating this much Solzhenitsyn 20 years ago, I would have said, are you out of your mind? But somehow it was the most natural thing in the world to do.
And Marian, I have to add that it's so helpful and so good to have you as the translator of all four of these volumes. So there is a continuity. Not only there, I think, a great fidelity in the translation, but there's a kind of continuity in the translator's voice. And you do a wonderful job. I mean, Solzhenitsyn has I think as he got older, there was a compression. He could say things very precisely. And that's hard to capture, and I think you do it very, very well. And I think Ignat told me recently that you and Stefan had finished with April, the first volume of April. No, that's not you.
April.
It's not you. Okay.
No.
Oh, you're just doing
There's something I didn't do. There's something of his that I didn't do. Yes.
Well, but again, March is as David pointed out in his opening remarks, March is the core of the work. It's and to have this complete. We started off probably when Ignat gave you that phone call some years ago. We started off with the augmented edition of August 1914 coming out in 89. October 16 in 1999. The works had long been out, of course, in Russian, and then French and some other languages. And for a while who knew if we would see the Red Wheel in English. So, and
Press.
What's that?
Thanks to Notre Dame Press.
Yeah, Notre Dame's commitment and fidelity, Steve Rinn's enthusiasm and commitment, it's really made all the difference. And I don't know about you, Marian, but I just love the design of the cover. The imagery is maybe before we end, we could each mention a scene from the book that is particularly striking. Here's a real little one early on, but I think it's illustrative of how those encounters in the street and all that can open up so many things that are suggestive. And it's when Olga Stolypina, the widow of Pyotr Stolypin, runs into her former footman on the streets of Petersburg, and he's somebody who worked for several czars, was very, very close to the assassinated Stolypin and his wife, and she sees him wearing a big red bow. And everyone was waving red, members of the royal family and all that. And she says to him, what is this film? That he says, only as a precaution, only as a precaution. It captures something in just a few lines. It captures something about the atmosphere. And no doubt that was, I don't know if it's taken from her memoir or whatever, but I have no doubt that was a authentic incident, and but it just struck me reading that's the kind of thing that a historian could not capture, but this unique mix that it's the Red Wheel has the ability to illumine things that are, it's a work of literature, but it's a work of literature that aims to be very faithful to history. And as you said before, it's multifaceted experiments and methods are at the service of that fidelity. So anyway, I'll let you share your insight with us.
The scene that I think that Solzhenitsyn had a little bit of a sense of humor. We don't think of him as having a sense of humor, but I think he did. Um, Maybe not tremendously developed, but developed enough. And when I was rereading the Kollontai chapter, and on her way when the revolution, the February March Revolution happens, and she's coming back from Sweden to join it, and she's going through most of the time she's thinking about her lover Shlatnikov, who she's about to give the heave ho. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
but what I really loved was this just juicy little moment when she gets to the Finnish border and she says, and they say, nobody can come in because, nobody can come in. And she says, but I'm returning, I'm a revolutionary. And she was on the, and they said, and they consulted the list and she was on the list, and her joy, it wasn't joy, it was more like glee, that she was on the list. They knew she was so important, and that she was coming back triumphant, basically. But
yeah,
it kind of the way he puts it is kind of it's a little bit catty, I would
yeah,
say.
yeah.
And I really
No, no, that's great. I remember that well. That whole chapter, as you pointed out before, is quite a remarkable chapter, and it's right before, I think, that a couple chapters before the sealed train. When the deal's set and Lenin and the revolutionaries are also about to return. Um, One thing we maybe could end on this note. You mentioned Solzhenitsyn and a sense of humor. I think he did have a sense of humor. He also lived in dark times and had, as we've both alluded to, a deep sense of mission. And that would affect maybe his judgment about how important a work like Parasites was, even though uh, it shows another side of Solzhenitsyn altogether. Um, I will tell you, if you look at the sort of archive of photographs of Solzhenitsyn, there's plenty of him smiling, even laughing. The journalists never publish him. And I think it's because an image developed of Solzhenitsyn as stern, as a Jeremiah, the Old Testament prophet, and all of that. And there was one picture. It has just recirculated a billion times. It was Solzhenitsyn addressing the Duma in the fall of 1994, and things have fallen apart and all that. And he's up there, and his hands are up in the air, and he looks very, very stern. And I've seen that reproduced about 1,000 times. There's also pictures of Solzhenitsyn where he's very serene, and we have one on the cover of the Solzhenitsyn Reader, outside, kind of a pastoral picture, but just a look of complete serenity. So the man had, the man had many aspects to him, and the remarkable thing is, given his life experience, the camps, the totalitarian state, and all that, he never drew deeply pessimistic, not to mention nihilistic conclusions from that. He There's a final note of, the good will win out, or he never despairs. And I think that hopefulness is is always there. Now, hopefulness is not the same thing as a robust sense of humor, but it does suggest an ability to look at the complexity of the human heart, or the complexity of human affairs. Do you want to have the last word, Marian?
no, that's fine. That was a good last word. That
Thank
was
you. Thank you. Thank you, David. This was great fun. And one great joy for me has been to have a gifted translator like Marian, who has clearly fallen in love with the book. Is that too much to say? But you have a real appreciation of, as a reader, as a translator, as a student of Russian literature, of the Red Wheel, and and I think that's great to see.
All right. Well, yeah, I guess on that note, I to reiterate, I mean, a lot of the conversation has focused on Solzhenitsyn's incredible gifts as a writer, but I think it is not to be diminished. And I want to make it clear, to the viewer, if they're not necessarily familiar with this, I mean, he did write all this in Russian, and so the labor of translating this, I think, is itself really a momentous literary achievement. That I want to make sure that I want to end on an acknowledgement of that. The the deep kind of linguistic cultural mastery necessary to really do justice to something like this is really remarkable. I mean, it's I think a reflection of really a lifetime of devotion um, to translating the Russian language into English. So, Marian, thank you so much. The press is extraordinarily proud to be able to offer these books, and we couldn't have done it without you. So, Marian, on behalf of the whole press, thank you so much for taking on this project and for seeing it through. And it really is, as Dan mentioned earlier, I mean, it's a good looking set. So, just to conclude, Books for Better Understanding series here with Dan Mahoney and Marian Schwartz, who translated Aleksander Solzhenitsyn's March 1917. Volume 4 is available now. So you can go to our website now and wrap up, get the final volume, maybe buy the other 3 if you've missed those. And yeah, thank you both again very, very much.